When Pearl Harbor, which incidentally is tomorrow, Pearl Harbor Day, December 7th, occurred, I was in high school in a little town in Maryland, Brunswick, Maryland, in Frederick County. And most of us kids could hardly wait to graduate so that we could participate in fighting the Japanese who did this terrible thing to our country. Most of us kids at that time were in our early teens. When I say early, 17, 18 years old. And we graduated, those in my class, in 1943. And I'd say 90% of the kids all enlisted right after we graduated from high school because we were anxious to get in and fight for our country. And the country was so united at that time, thank God. So I enlisted in July in the United States Marine Corps, and the quota was filled at Parris Island. And I was finally called in October to report to Parris Island, and incidentally, it was my first trip to South Carolina. Most memorable indeed, because boot camp was not necessarily a lot of fun, but it really taught us discipline and esprit de corps, if you will. After boot camp, I was asked what would I prefer to be involved in the Marine Corps, and they gave us three choices, and I said I'd like to be an aerial gunner in what they called the TBMs and the TBFs at that time. And the second choice was a paratrooper. Well, I later learned that paratroopers didn't work too well in the jungles, so the Marine Corps got out of that business pretty early. My third was in the infantry. And I thought, sure, if I didn't make the first two, I'd get to go to the infantry because that's where the grunts are needed. Well, I was sent up to from Parris Island to Camp Lejeune, North Carolina. And lo and behold, because I had taken shorthand and typing in school, they put me in quartermaster school of all things. Well, after 1 week in quartermaster school, I went to my first sergeant and I said, sir, I said, I would like to be transferred out of here. I didn't join the Marine Corps to pound on a typewriter and hand out clothing. I said, I would like very much to go in the infantry. He said, son, we might be able to accommodate you. Well, the next morning at 0800, the first sergeant came in our barracks and called out my name. A.W. Johnston? Yes, sir. We're able to accommodate you, son. You're going to Tent City. Well, when I got over there, so I packed my sea bag and away we went, 2 or 3 of us, and I was assigned to light machine guns. And just about the time I was finished up my machine gun training in .30 caliber light machine gun, I had an emergency appendectomy. And went in the hospital in Camp Lejeune, they took care of it. But in the meantime, my unit was getting ready to be transferred to California for deportation, if you will, to the South Pacific. Well, as a result, I lost my position as a gunner, and I was kind of a flunky, if you will, until I got overseas and went to a demolition school. But when we left North Carolina, we went on a troop train all the way across the country. And so about 97% of the troops during World War II moved by train, believe it or not. And we stayed at a place called Linda Vista, which was just north outside of Camp Pendleton in California. And we were there about a week bivouacked, and all of a sudden we were mustered and marched down to San Diego on a boarded ship. I never will forget the name of that ship. It was the Rochambeau, an old French liner. And we loaded her, and off we went, and took us 18 or 19 days zigzagging, and we didn't have escort. And we were all concerned about that because of the submarine action of the Japanese. And so we finally ended up in New Caledonia. We got in New Caledonia, and were there 3 days, and we were all assigned to various units in the Marine Corps. And I was assigned to the 1st Marine Division. When I got to Peleliu, a little island north of Guadalcanal in the Peleliu Island Group, I was assigned to the 7th Marines. And at that time, I was still kind of a guy without a country, if you will. I don't mean that literally, but as a figure of speech, I was not really assigned to any particular group. So I volunteered to go to demolition school. And they said, well, we can certainly take care of that. And so I went to demolition school, and I ended up in my MO when I came out, and you'll get a kick out of this, was specialist, demolition specialist. I was the furthest thing you ever seen from a specialist, I can assure you. But anyway, my first battle after training on Peleliu was the island of Peleliu. Now, Peleliu was a small island, 2.5 miles wide and 5.5 miles long. And we were told before we landed up there that it would be a 72-hour operation, and it would only be one division going in, and that was our division, the 1st Marine Division. Well, to say I was in the headquarters company, 7th Regiment at that time. And of course, once we got ashore, then I was sent to the various units and spent most of my time with a weapons company. And of course, as a demolition person, we were also trained to disarm booby traps, which wasn't my favorite job. Most of the time, when I was skeptical of what I was doing, I'd take a hand grenade and ignite it and get the heck away and take care of it that way rather than try to disarm it. But I ended up with the weapons company, and my main assignment, I guess, was trying to close caves, which was a very difficult job with all the coral on that particular rock. And again, I could, at that age, 18 years old, I could throw a satchel charge in a cave and run like a deer. As you can appreciate at that age. So after the Battle of Peleliu, and it turned out not to be a 72-hour, but it was 31 days before we secured the island. And we were finally relieved by the 81st Army, who came in for a little mop-up, if you will, because there were still some people tied up or hung up in caves, if you will. But the thing that I remember about Peleliu more than anything else was my first taste of war and how brutal and vicious it was. When I came out of the amphib, we transferred off we came down the net off an APA, a troop transport ship on nets, came down into LCVPs. They were like Higgins boats. And we transferred from Higgins boats into amphibious tractors because the amphibious, as you recall, hung up so badly on the island of Tarawa, and so many of our guys walked for 100 yards and were just mowed down. It was a terrible scene. So when we got into our amphibs and started in over the coral, which they could handle, when we hit the beach, I was in the type of amphib that dropped down from the back rather than the front, and when it dropped down and the sergeant said, move it out, when I came out of that thing, and this is the thing I remember about Peleliu as much as anything else, there was a dead Marine, or half of him, laying there. He was blown half in two. And I widened my step like everybody else, and we hit the beach. But both amphibious tractors were hit and on fire on each side of us going in. We lost an awful lot of amphibious tractors going in on Peleliu. The landing at Peleliu was comparable, only on a smaller scale, if you will, like Normandy, which if you've seen Sergeant Private Ryan, that was a good example of the D-Day on Normandy. Well, when I hit the beach, the first thing I did was I pulled out the New Testament, which I carried in my top pocket here, and I turned to the 23rd Psalm, and started reading it. And about the time I got about halfway through, the sergeant says, move out. But I finished reading it. Please believe me, and we moved out. And the first day on Peleliu, we actually gained, you won't believe this, maybe 100 yards. because we were pinned down practically the whole time, because the Japanese really had us zeroed in. Well, so much for Peleliu. Thank goodness I escaped that without a scratch. And we did lose a lot of people there. We lost about, with injuries, about over 1/3 of our division. That is, killed and wounded. After the battle, we boarded ship, and they said, well, the rumor was, the scuttlebutt, as they called it back in those days, was you're going to Hawaii for R&R, rest and recreation. Well, as it turned out, we went right back to Pavuvu, which was a terrible place to be. Believe me, it was strictly a coconut grove, and the food wasn't all that good, but we were kids, we could handle it. So we trained there on Pavuvu for another 6 or so months, and doing the training, our colonel was Colonel Snedeker of the 7th Regiment, the 1st Divvy, and he was a great baseball fan. So he organized a 1st Marine Division baseball league. Well, that was my first love, and what I wanted to do is play baseball professionally when I was able to do so. Of course, the war changed that, as you can appreciate. But I caught for the 7th Marine Regiment, and we won what we called the Little World Series. And 7 of the guys on our team had played professional baseball, and I was the catcher, believe it or not. And at 19 years old, it was quite an experience, as you can appreciate. And after the couple of months of baseball, back into more extensive training, and after the training, we boarded a ship, went to Guadalcanal for ship-to-shore maneuvers, back to Pavuvu, and then we finally, a couple of weeks later, loaded aboard ship, and took off for we didn't know where, but we rendezvoused at a place called Ulithia. And at that time, when we got in there, we couldn't believe the number of ships. And supposedly, I didn't count them, of course, but we were told later that there was 1,450 ships of all different types, of course. Troop carriers, aircraft carriers, battleships, cruisers, destroyers, you name it, LSTs. And we rendezvoused there and took off a couple days later and landed on Okinawa. It was on Easter Sunday, 1945. The landing on Okinawa was a piece of cake compared to Peleliu. We got very little fire, a little bit of sniper fire, small arm fire, but no heavy fire. In my unit, the 7th Regiment, we landed like the other 5th and 1st. See, in the Marine Corps, we had the 1st Regiment, the 5th Regiment, the 7th Regiment, and the 11th. The 11th was artillery, the other 3 were infantry units. So we hit on the north end of the island, we marched up, and as I say, other than patrol action and a little bit of small fire from the enemy, it was really, very few casualties were taken, thank God. But then, you know, there was not only the 1st Marine Division that went in on Okinawa, there was the 6th Marine Division also. They were on our right flank. Then there was 3 divisions of the Army, as I recall, the 96th, the 27th, and the 29th. I may be wrong on the 29th because I think they were in Europe, but it was the 27th from New York and the 96th and maybe the 88th, 81st, I guess. But as it turned out, the Army went down to 3 divisions to take on the Japanese in the southern tier of the island. And they ran into just all kinds of resistance. Because what the general in charge of the Japanese on Okinawa, he brought all of his forces back and they tied up in caves and on high ground. And while there wasn't any high mountains, but there was just enough high ground that gave them a tremendous advantage when you were approaching on the ground. So we were up north about 2 weeks and we got orders to go south. So we marched south about 30 miles before we started to get into some real action again. And we relieved the 27th, and I forget what the 6th, I relieved the 96th, I believe. that is the 6th Marine Regiment. And we were there from latter part of April to the middle of July before the island was pronounced secure. And in the month of May, it rained for 3 straight weeks. And of course, every night we had to dig in a foxhole. And they would be 2 to a hole, and we'd hour on and hour off during the night, you know, because the Japanese were great on infiltration. And we were able to take care of that by staying awake and with flares and anything we heard or moved, we fired at, because nobody in air outfit or any land outfit moved during the night because you were dead, because we knew it was Japanese, and that was the thing. And you had a password. The only thing you did with the password, if you went from your foxhole to the next guy's, which didn't happen too often. But the rain was so bad that we would actually, we'd dig a foxhole, and before we could get in that rascal, we'd have to take our helmets and bail the water out. And I never will forget, we were on the lines the first time about 4 straight weeks, and we were pulled off for just a little R&R before we went back for a few days. And all of us pulled our shoes off, and our stockings were completely gone. I'd just rotted out, and skin came off our feet. You know, we looked at, what in the world? But just what it did to us, because we were just soaking wet day and night for 3 straight weeks. But Okinawa, I received just a little piece of shrapnel in the left leg, and the corpsman said to me, it was actually from a grenade, corpsman said to me, he said, "I fixed you." He was a Filipino, I never will forget it. He said, "Let me sign you up for Purple Heart." I said, "No, you're not." And I'll tell you why I didn't. Because the day before, one of my buddies, he said, "Will you lift up my leg for me?" When I did, it fell off. And I couldn't, for the life of me, want to be a recipient of the Purple Heart with a small little shrapnel thing in the leg, and to think he got the same medal for the same kind of, and then so many of our guys lost arms, legs, it just, you know, just unbelievable. But anyway, after Okinawa, we went back to the north end, and I guess it was near one of the airports there. Could have been Katina or Johnston airport, and we tied up and we set up tents, and we were there for, I guess, 2 weeks, and all of a sudden, a typhoon came in. Now, we call them hurricanes or typhoons over there. And it was the funniest thing. I had picked up a Jap pistol along the way from a dead Japanese, I should say. And I wanted to bring it home, but yet we were kids and kind of a little mischievous, if you will. And we all like to have a little nip of something. And so I traded that pistol in for 5 gallons of sick bay alcohol from the sea beefs and brought it back, and we cut it in half with grapefruit juice. And the night of the typhoon, and we were all kind of bent out of shape, for the lack of a better explanation. And the tent came down on top of us. My buddy looked over at me and he said, "Hey, Will, I think I just received the Navy Cross." Oh, it was so funny. But it wasn't but a couple of weeks later. Most of us had been in the Pacific about 2 years at that time. So we thought we were going home, because of the scuttlebutt of the word was at that time, "We're going to get you fellows home. You've got enough points to go home." All it took was 50 points back then. All of us had enough points with combat duty and time overseas. So we ended up boarding ship there at Okinawa, got aboard ship, and we were so delighted we were going home. Everybody was just happy as a lark, you can appreciate. Particularly those that escaped, you know, the real serious problems of serious injuries or death. We'd been out to sea perhaps 2 days, and the colonel on the ship in charge of our group made an announcement. He said, "Now hear this." That's Navy parlance, if you will, when they want to send a message to you aboard ship. He said, "There's been a little change of plans." Uh-oh, we thought, now what? He said, "We're going to North China to repatriate the Japanese who had been in control for 14 years in North China." And We all looked at one another and said, I can't believe this. So needless to say, not a lot of happy campers at that time. But we finally ended up in North China, and we got a great greeting from the Chinese there. We landed at a little place called Taku in North China. And we were there a day, and then we marched into a town of a couple of million people at that time. It was Tientsin. The name's changed now, just like Peking and Beijing now, as you know. Well, I was there 3 weeks, and we were staying in an old Japanese schoolhouse, and they'd furnished us some sleeping bags, and we didn't have cots or anything at that time. And so we were there, and we were able to go on Liberty every other night and go out and get a little something to eat and so forth. And we thought, well, this isn't all that bad. Well, this was in latter part of September and October. But then we got the word that, of all things, my regiment, the 7th Regiment, was going north to Qingwantao to guard the railroad, because the communists at that time were blowing up the railroad about every night. So, lo and behold, we boarded a train, and we went to a little place called Peleliu Beach, detrained there. Some of the other guys went on to Peleliu Beach, which was another 17 mile up the road from where Peleliu Beach was, and we were assigned different areas to guard the railroad. Well, it got very cold. See, that's right across from North Korea also, where we were at. And we almost froze to death, and I'll tell you why. All we had was little field jackets, and we wasn't prepared for cold weather. And it was late December when we received the big parkers and the big fur hats, that we really started to, feel like we were human again. Fortunately, I was only there just a little under 5 months, and then us guys with the most points were sent home. And we came home on a merchant ship, I think it was called the Sea Sturgeon, and we were 18 days coming home, and as you can appreciate, we didn't experience jet lag. But we got to San Diego, and well, before we got in, there was an announcement. Now hear this, there's been a possibility the ship may be quarantined because somebody had a serious disease. And we thought, oh no, not again. But as it turned out, they let the ship dock. We got off, and I think every one of us, when we got off that ship in San Diego, we got on our knees and kissed the ground that we were back in the good old USA. First thing I did was call my mom and dad and say I'm home safe. Then I called my girlfriend, who I was going with before I joined the Marine Corps. And after I was home 3 months before we got married, we've been married 62 years happily thereafter, and that's pretty much the end of my story, sir. We were, needless to say, pleased, because when we were on Okinawa, we were actually training to go to Japan, like just about all the units in the South Pacific. So we were elated over the fact that after the second bomb that the Japanese finally surrendered. Well, I personally feel it was justified, and many of us who were in the South Pacific at the time, I don't think you would have found anyone who did not think it was justified, because, as I mentioned earlier, we were training to go to Japan, along with probably 15 other divisions. And the estimate at that time that there could have been as many as 1 million Americans killed in this maneuver, if you will, or exercise in invading Japan. And one of the things that I witnessed on Okinawa that was very interesting, and I was a witness to them as a result of being in a foxhole looking out over the Okinawa Bay at the kamikaze planes going in and hitting our ships. And the Navy took a tremendous beating there. In 1958, and the first president I voted for was Mr. Truman. And I'm an old conservative, but I voted for him because at that time I felt that he saved a lot of lives, including mine. Well, I met him, and I was working as on the railroad as a trainmaster at Union Station, Washington, D.C. And a good friend of mine knew Mr. Truman, and he said, "Bill, would you like to meet the former president and Mrs. Truman, Bess?" I said, "I'd be happy to, because I'd like to personally thank him for what he did to save so many lives, in spite of what you read today about how bad it was." And I had that opportunity, and I met him on a railroad private car there at the station, and he gave me 2 of his books, Memoirs of Harry Truman, and he personally signed them both to me, and I have them at home now. And that was really one of the highlights of after the war that I experienced, and it's just something that you never forget. And to me, those 2 novels are priceless. To be perfectly frank with you, I was scared to death. And I'm certainly not alone in that situation. But you know, we were a well-trained outfit. The Marine Corps has the reputation of being well-trained, and when we're told to do something, you do it. I mean, when the sergeant says move out, because at that time I was just a PFC, and when I came out I was just a corporal, because there was very few promotions this side of the ocean, as we used to sing. Well, I went to work on the railroad and started at the very bottom, and after a number of years, quite a few in fact, and a number of moves, like about 11 different moves, relocations, if you will. My final job, I represented the industry in Washington, D.C., and my title was Vice President of Operations and Maintenance for the Association of American Railroads, and my job was representing all the railroads on those operating and safety matters in the United States, Canada, and Mexico. And it was a very interesting assignment, and I held that assignment for 10 years before I retired. We had a condo here before I retired, which we enjoyed very much, and we moved here when I retired in '88, August '88, and I retired at 63. I could have worked 2 more years, but while I had about that much sanity left, working in Washington, D.C. and dealing with the federal government and all the agencies, I thought I'd better get out of town. And fortunately, financially, my wife and I were able to retire, and the good Lord has blessed us, other than the fact my wife had a serious stroke and about 10 years ago, but she's coming along pretty good now. I mean, she has problems, but we're still, we'll be married in May, 63 years. Oh, absolutely, absolutely, without question. In fact, the matter, I am the past Commandant of the Marine Corps League at Myrtle Beach. I belong to the 1st Marine Division Association, the China Marine Association, the VFW, the American Legion, you name it. And we do a lot of good work. Right now, one of our big projects is the Rudolph, where we're sending boxes to our troops overseas. And we do Toys for Tots every year, which I'm involved in. And, you know, naturally I'm prejudiced, but I still love the Marine Corps and always will.